All right, so in this video, what we're going to do is take a look at how we can set up some basic Redshift materials using some textures we found on the internet. Now, depending on the type of material or where you get it from, you might find different map types. Some might have roughness or metalness, opacity, who knows? So I'm going to go through two of the more common material types, show you how we can put those textures in, some adjustments we can make, just so you have an idea of how to approach creating materials in Redshift. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so here's kind of the end result here. We're going to create a brick material as well as a metal-ish material, metal panel material. Now these textures are from C4D Center, which is one of the places I do look for textures since they're relatively high resolution, they're free, and they include several different map types here. So this brick one, for instance, has base color, ambient occlusion, roughness, normal, height. The metal one, on the other hand, has metallic mask, as well as roughness, base color, and these others. So like I said, there is some variety in here depending on the properties we're going to be using. But as these are two of the more common types of materials, I thought they would be a good way to approach getting started. So what I'm going to do is just come here and let's see, we can just delete all of this stuff so I can start from scratch here. Now I do have some cubes here that I've already created. They do have a fillet on here. I don't necessarily recommend adding a fillet if you're doing this to a cube, but it's going to help me show a specific problem that we run into with fillets and whatnot. So yeah, this is what I have for the setup here. Now this could be geometry you're creating on your own as well. So that might make things a little bit different, especially when it comes to the displacement. But for the most part, things should look pretty similar. I'll just reset my layout here to get rid of my picture viewer. I am going to use my Redshift render view instead of my perspective view here. So I will just dock that to the side and I'll dock my node editor here in a second. But then what I'm going to do is open up my material manager, which somehow ended up there. So let's just fix that by redocking that. Okay, I'm going to create a new material and I'll just call this, let's just say brick new. Okay, apply it to our brick here. Go ahead and start our rendering and open this up in our node editor and then dock this underneath. Something like that. So we have the default gray plastic to start. And I am using the Redshift standard material here. And I actually do think it makes it a bit easier. I think that's one of the things they were going for with this new material was to make it easier to create PBR-based materials. So a lot of the websites where you find PBR or more photographically realistic materials are going to have these types of map types. And a lot of the places we're going to need to plug things in are visible here. So what I'll do is find my brick textures. And if you didn't know you could do this, you can actually just drag in the textures from, say, Explorer or Finder into your node editor here. And the advantage of that is they come in named. So that way, it's a little bit easier to tell what map is what. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of organizing here. My base color should be up top. Height and normal are going to be towards the bottom. I'm sorry, height, normal, there we go. Roughness will be up here, and ambient occlusion I'll actually put by my base color. So looks a bit unorganized. We may clean things up a little bit, but that's kind of where we're starting. I'm going to start by just connecting these one by one. So base color obviously goes into base color. Okay, ambient occlusion we'll tackle here very shortly. Let's take the easy ones out first. Roughness goes into reflection roughness, as you might expect. And one thing that's important to point out here is, just because these are the textures that I'm given, doesn't mean I have to use the end result here. I'll show you some different ways you could modify this material to get it exactly to what you want, or hopefully closer. Okay, let's take our normal map and plug that into a bump map. Why? I don't know. Doesn't make sense to me. Connect that from the out color to our input here, and then connect the bump map node to the bump map property. Why it isn't all in one, I'll never know. But in our bump map node, since we are using a normal map, we need to switch the input map type to tangent spaced normal. Now, if you were doing something where you created a high polygon version of your geometry, baked out a normal map, and we're applying it to a low polygon version of your geometry, that is what object space normal is for. So tangent space normal, we can see what it's doing here. One of the things I do like to do and recommend as well is as you're setting these up, especially for these properties like roughness, um, like normal map here, is to just look at one property at a time so we can see what that normal map is doing. We may take a look at it and go, it's kind of doing the opposite of what we want, or there's too much or too little. And by seeing just that map, we can see that problem. Now, we're already maybe starting to see some of the issues with adding a fillet here. And really that issue being it screws up our UVs, which is something that's going to be or can be problematic, especially with a displacement map. But I'll connect the roughness back. Okay, so if you want to see how to add the ambient occlusion, there are a few different ways, but if you want to think of it like Photoshop, I think the color layer node is the easiest, although really multiply here would be even easier, where we would multiply our ambient occlusion against our beauty pass. Now, I'm not even sure we really need this ambient occlusion, which is even more reason for me to use, say, this color layer here, because I can plug my base color into the base layer, my ambient occlusion into the layer 1 color, and connect this back up here. And we're just seeing the ambient occlusion here, but now in my attribute manager, I can switch the blend mode for layer 1, which is our ambient occlusion pass, to multiply, just like if we are using ambient occlusion, say in Photoshop or After Effects. And then we can control the mask to control the strength of this. Now, honestly, I probably wouldn't use the ambient occlusion. I would probably use a very low value here. And I almost would never use it if I was using displacement as well. I think it maybe is a good kind of in between for that, because displacement does have some issues or some drawbacks, as we'll see. And so this may be a good way to kind of get something kind of somewhat in the middle there. So that's it for our basic setup. Let's talk about some modifications or some changes we could do. Kind of already saw how we could adjust the ambient occlusion. For the base color here, what we could do is add, say, a color correct, and we can drag and drop that in there. And this will allow you to do a few things, but the main reason why I would use a color correct here might be to work with the color. If I want to shift the hue ever so slightly, I could do something like that. Okay. I could also adjust the saturation. All right. That's something else I could very easily control with this. If I'm going to be doing anything like with levels or brightness contrast, I have another kind of technique I would use for that, something I wouldn't really use the color correct for. And I'll show that more in the next material, the metal, because I think it's going to be a little bit more apparent. But even here, I think my the reflection amount is too strong, so I may dial back the weight until I'm happy with that. I mean, I could also adjust the roughness as well to try and help with that, but that's looking, maybe a bit better. We still have our displacement though, and we are going to connect that using a displacement node. No idea why it just can't be there, but it connects into the texture map, which is somehow different than the texture input for our bump, and connect this to our displacement property here. Now, we're going to get a little bit of displacement here based on the amount of geometry we have in this object. And you'll notice this cube, it's subdivided a little bit more. There's definitely some segments there, but really not enough to give us the amount of detail that's in our displacement here. And I'm just soloing this node by clicking on the S here. You can do that on any node you want, okay? But not a bad way to kind of preview the values we should be seeing. So that's helping a little bit, but as I mentioned earlier, I do think it helps to maybe just focus on one node at a time. And so now when we're seeing the displacement, okay, that looks like we may be okay, I lied. Turns out it was just the bump map not being, normal map not being refreshed, and it happens. So what we need to do is right click on our object, come over here to our render tags and choose the Redshift object tag. Okay, the Redshift object tag in the geometry section has our displacement options, which we need to turn on. We can check override, And then we can just check displacement on. Now, there's a little bit of something you want to be careful of, and that's this auto bump mapping. So that is what's giving us a lot of that detail. So we're actually not getting any displacement. Okay, so something to think about. Now, like I said, in order to have displacement, you need to have enough geometry. And if you want to manually add it, great. Don't recommend that. Instead, I would recommend using tessellation. And this is very much like a subdivision surface, but built into Redshift. And since Redshift's doing it, it's a little bit more advanced. Redshift has a little bit easier time with it, and it's happens at render time. So, keeps my scene a little bit lighter. And just like that, you can see the detail we're getting here. Keep in mind, creating more geometry can slow down your machine, takes up more video RAM, can also increase render time. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes it's not worth it. Is really that much better than what I was seeing with the auto bump mapping. Okay, they look pretty similar to me. Keep in mind, auto bump mapping will not kind of change the silhouette of this, where displacement will. It really comes down to how close we're going to be to this object. Now, if I wasn't happy with how much displacement I was seeing, there's a couple of things I would do. The first is going to be to start with the maximum displacement and displacement scale. You really do need to work with both of these values. So maybe something like 3 there can help a little bit, and then 5 here can help as well. And you can see, yep, things are starting to get maybe pushed a bit too far. You can see now, though, how it's changing the silhouette of this geometry. All right, we're seeing shadows cast from it, which is really why we don't need that ambient occlusion. And if I zoom in, we'll see that this is going to probably look a little bit pixelated here. That's where maybe turning down the minimum edge length can help, okay, to smooth things out, allow Redshift to subdivide and give us more detail, along with perhaps maximum subdivisions. And also with this, I would usually recommend turning off smooth subdivision, since that is also very much like the subdivision surface where it's going to round out corners. Okay, so turning that off probably won't have too much of an effect because of the amount of geometry I already have here, but that's looking pretty good. And now I would connect back up everything else. So there's my diffuse, or my base color, I should say, my roughness, our normal map, and now we have everything kind of plugged in. And we can take one more look at it and see what we think about this. If there's too much reflection, too much displacement, whatever the case may be. But overall, that's looking pretty good. There's definitely still some stretching, which is actually a little bit harder to see now that I zoomed out. And that is probably due to a UV issue where I didn't lay out the UVs to this. So it's not 100% certain, what to show where, and the sizing could be different, all sorts of minor issues you can run into with displacement like that. Sometimes your geometry just breaks at corners as well if you haven't adjusted your UVWs. But that's the brick. Wanted to show that one. I am going to turn off the geometry override though, just to speed things up a little bit while I talk about the metal. Since that one has that metalness or metal mask texture, although you can probably guess where it goes. So we have our metal, and just like I did before, what I will do is drag in those textures. I'm doing that just off screen here, so give me just 1 second. There we go. Drag them in and organize them a little bit. Do like to stay organized in here, just like anywhere else, whether it's Object Manager, Material Manager, Desktop, you name it. So I think that's metalness. We have roughness, we have height, we have normal. Perfect. So base color can go there. Our metalness can go there. Right? You can see that's kind of making this very metal, okay, which is great. We have our roughness. See that doing things as well. We need our bump map node. Connect that up. I'm going a little bit quicker with this one since we've seen this previously. And honestly, sometimes your normal map can look okay in height field where, it should be a bump map. So if you do like that better than the normal, by all means, keep it. But, as these textures were intended, it should be set to normal. And once again, if you want to see what it looks like, well, just remove the other connections, and now you'll get a sense of what that normal map is doing. And once again, having some issues there. Pretty sure it's due to my lack of UVs, although who knows, because now nothing's plugged in. But yeah, just keep that in mind. I'll connect everything back up. We have our metalness, our roughness. That just leaves us with our displacement. Before we get to that though, I do want to show you how I would make some adjustments to this. So let's say I plugged in these textures and I go, yeah, that's still a bit too shiny, too reflective. I'm just using the sun and sky here, so we can see some pretty strong reflections. Well, the way I would fix that is really kind of two different maps I might go to, either the metalness or my roughness. Okay, because the metalness is pretty straightforward here, where this is metal, this is not metal. Okay, roughness, little bit trickier, because what we're seeing is white areas are where the roughness value is higher, so we have more blurred reflections, where the darker values are less rough, closer to 0. Think, black 0, white 1 for our roughness values here, and so that is what we're seeing. And what I would do in either one of these properties, although I think we're going to have a little bit more play in our roughness here, is take a ramp and drop that in between here. And you can see the ramp does get connected as the alt input. And it actually does change the way things look. I think it has something to do with, our color space here being set to auto versus, explicitly saying if it's an sRGB image or if it's an ACES or whatever. But within this ramp, and I'm going to solo this, I can use this very much like a levels, to where I can say, all right, let's start brightening this up a little bit, to make things more rough. Okay. And once I, kind of show that, like to come back here and, as I'm doing this, take a look around and say, all right, maybe that's a little bit better. Maybe I want to push this a bit further and just kind of go till I'm happy with this. And I can do this same thing for my metalness as well. But like I said, this is pretty much already pure black and pure white. I don't know how much further I can push that. Roughness as well, it's a grayscale image. It's an 8-bit, PNG, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Yeah. So actually maybe not 8 bits, but it's still a lower quality image than, say, a TIFF, a Targa 32-bit floating point. So how much we can do here can be a bit tricky. And at some point, it can break the image. We just push it too far. So just keep that in mind as you're working with this. I might want to bring some of the darker values in as well to kind of help push this. And ultimately, that's how I would adjust this. Now, to finish this off with our displacement here, once again, going to need a displacement node. I'll connect this to texture text map, displacement, and just like before, add my Redshift object tag, and I'll just disconnect everything else just so we can see what we're getting, and I'm not going to be tricked again. So there we go. In our geometry section, check override, check displacement. And once again, that auto bump mapping, maybe that's what you want. Maybe that's good enough for how close we're going to be to this. Getting some kind of world swirly pattern. If I get too close, okay. Another thing you may want to consider, depending on what renderer these textures were made from, is inverting something. Maybe it's the bump map, or displacement, though I doubt it. Could be the roughness or the metalness. And in that case, I would just take a color invert and use that as kind of a go-between, and that will switch the colors for you. So just keep that in mind, depending on what renderer you're using. Sometimes the values are the opposite, especially for roughness or metalness. And occasionally you want to invert the bump as well, though that's not as frequent. So back here, just so I can see what the displacement is actually doing, I'll uncheck enable auto bump, and there it goes away. So I was getting no displacement. I'm going to need tessellation with this, and you can see very little. And if I solo this map, there actually isn't as much as there was in my brick. So I'm not going to expect as different or as, you know, crazy results here. I'll start by doing my same kind of maximum displacement value of 3, displacement scale 5. Those values seem to have worked pretty well for me for the most part. And that actually looks pretty good. Keep in mind, it is making my object a little bit larger, though. I don't know if you caught that. Um, as I change those values, and depending on if this is sitting on the ground or its relation to other objects, that is something you will need to consider. So honestly, that looks pretty good. I don't think I need to adjust the minimum edge length or maximum subdivisions because there just isn't a lot of detail in this displacement, and that's fine. The displacement is usually for the larger details, or at least that's what I've seen from C4D Center. Could be different depending on where you get your textures from. But yeah, it's going to just be the larger changes in the geometry, and then the smaller details will come from our bump map, our normal map. And in this case, I'm probably going to leave the auto bump mapping off because it was just giving me some really strange results. Maybe just pushing things a bit too far. But I'll now connect everything back and we can see the end result. Right, and if anything's broken, let's just refresh. So this may be one of those smooth subdivision. Hey, there we go. So as I said, that can sometimes be a problem, and we saw it right there. And here is our end result. Maybe still some issues like on these corners. Once again, this object did not have its UVs adjusted or laid out, so that can certainly cause problems. But overall, I think this is looking pretty good and that it's a great place to end the video. So that will do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If there's anything else you would like to see, please let me know. And until next time, take care.